Hello, this week we're going to talk about Chapter 7, the history of American education, and it's a continuance of what we talked about last week with Chapter 1. In colonial times, mostly the boys were educated, not the females, and they were educated for religious purposes. They were taught the alphabet and taught how to read and write and do arithmetic, and it was all for the basis and the purpose of being able to read the Bible. The boys were taught trades. They often were apprentices and would go out and work for other people and maybe working on farms or working in a printer shop or doing things like that. And the girls um, would be sent back home to learn how to sew and cook and clean, and they were focused more on housekeeping. So they didn't get a whole lot of education that the boys did. The role of religion in education was huge, and I love that in your book they call it God's classrooms because it's pretty much what it was. The students would come to school, they would learn all about the Bible, and the schools were set up to save their souls. That's what the whole purpose of education was to have them so rooted and grounded in religion that when they were adults they would go the right way. Dames, it talks in here about dame schools. Dame schools was where the children would go to the women in the town or the village and be taught things like reading and writing and math, and eventually they started doing this for fees, so they got a little bit of money to do that. And then that was when they were really young. And when they were about 7, the boys would go and live with masters. And pretty much it was sort of like a foster care system type deal, where the kids would go and live with another family, and that family would act as their parents or their guardians for the time period that they lived there, and then they would learn a trade while they were there. Finally, in 1647, the Puritans decided that they needed to have some type of a law put in place to where education was mandatory. So they came up with this Old Deluder Satan law that said every town that had 50 people or more had to pay a teacher to teach the children to read and write, and that every town that had at least 100 people had to provide a Latin grammar school to prepare their students for the university. And then they actually were penalized and fined if they didn't do that. So the Boston Latin Grammar School was formed about 1635, and it was for children, boys that were wealthy. It was boys between the ages of 7 and 14, and it was the first step on the road to creating the first American high school. Shortly after that, in 1636, Harvard College was established, and Harvard was the first college in America. A lot of people don't know that, and it was basically a religious college that was the sole purpose was to educate ministers. Blacks and Native Americans during this time period didn't have educational opportunities. In the middle colonies, there was a lot more diversity. You know, they had a variety of people, not just Puritans, but also Catholics and Mennonites, Dutch, Swedes. So they had a lot more diversity. So there they had some private schools because each one of those different cultures wanted their children educated in their culture. So they had a lot more diversity there. And then it talks about, your chapter talks about St. Augustine, Florida, being the first city in the United States, in North America, and the fact that it was run by the Spanish, so there were Spanish schools set up there. And in your textbook on page 240 at the top, I'm going to read these points to you. Education has come a long way from colonial days and from Christopher Lamb's class, or has it? Consider the following. The colonial experience established many of today's educational norms. Some of those are local control of schools, compulsory education, tax-supported schools, and state standards for teaching in schools. So all that has been in place since colonial times. The second thing is the colonial experience highlighted many of the persistent tensions tension points that challenge schools today, like what is the role of religion in the classroom? How can we equalize the quality of education in communities? How can the barriers of racism, sexism, religious intolerance, and classism be eliminated so that all children receive equal educational opportunities? And how can we prepare the most competent teachers? So, all of those questions we have continually been working on trying to find the answers to those since the colonial days. Thomas Jefferson, who was our third president, during the 1700s, he had a large part in the educational system. He maintained that education should be more widely available to white children from all economic and social classes. Now, we all know the story of Thomas Jefferson and the fact that he actually had children um, by slaves. So we know that he had slaves, but we also know that he was partial to them, meaning that he didn't treat them bad. He oftentimes freed his slaves. So I think it's very interesting to see that while he's not at the point in the 1700s of saying we need to educate our black children, he does stand up for all white children, no matter what economic class they're in. He wanted free education for kids. And then in 1749, Benjamin Franklin wanted to have schools that were created that would educate all children, just like Thomas Jefferson, but that they would be free of religious influence. So he started these academies. And the Franklin Academy was considered the most important secondary school in America at one point. Jefferson's commitment to educating all whites and Franklin's commitment to a practical program of non-sectarian study offering elective courses served as American educational thought from its European roots. So those two men were instrumental in setting up what we know today as free and public education for all students. The next man we have to talk about is Horace Mann. And if you'll remember from last week, I mentioned him to you and said that he's very important. Horace Mann became the nation's leading advocate for the establishment of the common school that we know today as public elementary school. What he did was he became, in Massachusetts, he became the secretary, which today is what we would consider a superintendent. And he believed that public education should serve both practical and idealistic goals. And what we mean by that is that we should educate children not only to be academic, but to include athletics, to include our agricultural programs, to include industry skills, whether it be home economics, or it be the having a greenhouse, or computer education programs, that kind of thing. People fought him on this concept because they were worried. Back in those days, the children did a lot of work on the farms. So you were taking child labor, you were taking those laborers out of the home and out of the farm environment and putting them in a schoolhouse all day. So a lot of families didn't know how they were going to still run their farms without that help. Also, in order to have public education, they had to set up some types of a tax base. And so families not only were sending their kids to school, but they were having to pay taxes to keep the schools up. And all the private schools, with the movement of public schools, the private schools lost people because public schools were free to people. And those who couldn't afford to go to private schools, or even those who could but barely, would send their kids to public school. He also worked to prepare teachers better. He wanted teachers to be more prepared in what to teach and to specialize in certain areas. He wanted them to have newer teaching methods so that the classroom instruction was more effective. And he did not want kids to be punished with corporal punishment. The Puritans talked about putting the rod to the child. Students were often spanked in school if they got things wrong, and he didn't agree with that kind of thing. He wanted us as teachers to use positive reinforcements to motivate students to learn. He also worked to end slavery, and he wanted women to have economic and educational rights. And he also worked to try to limit the negative impact of alcohol. And then there's, I'm going to leave you to read about all the different um, the groups like the Native Americans. It talks about your textbook talks about the Native Americans and how they were moved to reservations and how little they were educated. Um, and then on page 245, it goes on to talk about gender barriers in teaching. And I thought this was a very interesting part of your textbook. It was just interesting to me. It talks about the fact that at one time in the beginning, most of the teachers were male. And then all of a sudden, more and more schools opened and they needed more people. Like we talked about earlier, teaching was not something that would get you rich. So these people they finally ended up having to hire women to teach. So the women would come in and they would start teaching, and then all of a sudden they were concerned that the boys were being feminized by these female teachers, and they didn't want the female teachers to be married. We talked about that also. Um, they wanted them to be dedicated to the school system. And so eventually it shifted back around to where more men started teaching again after World War II. And then when that happened, the male teachers were seen as gay. So now we have about 90%, I think it said 90% of our teachers now are women. And then on page 248, John Dewey. John Dewey was the most influential educator of the 20th century. John Dewey was he believed in progressivism, and that includes several components. It broadens the school program to include health concerns, family and community life issues, and a concern for vocational education. Because let's face it, not all of our students are going to go to college. Some of them may want to go to a trade school and become diesel mechanics or coal miners or those kinds of jobs. And so this progressive education said we're going to train all of our students to do wherever their path takes them. Second, progressivism applies a new research in psychology and the social sciences to classroom practices. And third, progressivism emphasized a more democratic educational approach, accepting the interests and needs of a more diverse student body. Because at this time we have all different types of students in school, not just religious students, and we're teaching them all different types of courses. We need to allow students, progressivism believes that students learn best when they are learning based on their interests. And we know that to be true today. If you ask them to write a report on, tearing down the rainforest, they're not as interested in that as, something like how to beat a cheat code in Call of Duty. So if they're writing about something they're interested in or they're learning about something they're interested in, then they're going to learn to a deeper degree. The role of the teacher in progressivism is to allow students to follow their interests, like we talked about, and to be able to identify the student needs and build upon those. In the 30s, they had something called an 8-year study where they looked at progressive education, and this was what the results was. They earned a slightly higher grade point average. They earned higher grades in all fields except for foreign languages. They tended to specialize in the same fields as more traditional students. They received slightly more academic honors. They were judged to be more objective and more precise thinkers, and they were judged to possess a higher intellectual curiosity and greater drive. So I'm going to let you read the rest of the chapter on your own. The part from 253 over to 256 about the Black Americans and the struggle for a chance to learn. You definitely need to be familiar with Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. It's a very interesting story, but one we probably all know about how blacks came to be educated in this country. So I'm going to leave the rest of the chapter to you to look at and learn about. And next week we will talk about Chapter 8 and the philosophy of education. And you can start thinking about what your own philosophy is. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer those.